I'm very excited to introduce Dr. Bhakti, my friend here.
Yeah.
And I have known her forever, but it's the first time I'm able to host her. She is a Wilson Center Distinguished Lecturer today. And Bhakti Shringarpure is a leading post-colonial literature scholar who has been working at the intersections of academia and public humanities for the last 10 or so years, even more than that actually. Her work engages questions of decolonization, race, gender, and violence through a focus on literary and cultural production from the global south and their circuits of dissemination. She's currently an associate professor jointly appointed in the Department of English and Institute of Women's Studies, Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at the University of Connecticut. She's also faculty for Comparative Literary and Cultural Studies and the Indigeneity, Race, Ethnicity, and Politics program. Bhakti Shringarpure wears many, many hats, and I'm going to cover some of those. She has been the co-founder of the online magazine Warscapes in 2002 to create an alternative space for writing reportage, reviews, and art that is often kept out of mainstream media circulation. Warscapes was awarded grants by the Open Society Foundation and the Flora Foundation and has recently transitioned into the Radical Books Collective under Professor Shringarpure's leadership. The Radical Books Collective organizes virtual book clubs as a response to the need for a progressive, alternative, and non-commercial approach to books and publishing. It was recently profiled in the magazine Literary Hub and dubbed as a fast-growing initiative with an international audience of journal readers, academics, intellectuals, and book lovers. Recent authors who have accepted invitations to attend this collective are Nobel Prize-winning Abdul Razak Gurna, Amitav Ghosh, Jennifer Makumbi, Chinelo Opranta, and many, many, many other illustrious names. Professor Shringarpure's book, Cold War Assemblages, Decolonizing to Digital, published in 2019 from Routledge, unfolds the history of post-coloniality and its effect on literary production during the Cold War. Her edited works are several. They include Literary Sudans, an anthology of literature from Sudan and South Sudan published by Africa World Press, Imagine Africa, Archipelago Books, Mediterranean, Migrant Crossings, Upset Press, and Insurgent Feminisms, Women Right War, published by Zuban in India and South Asia, and soon to be published from a press in Canada. I'm forgetting the name, I'm sorry. She is the co-translator from French, Newstead Prize-winning writer Boubacar Boris Diop's novel Kavina. It was published by Indiana University Press. And I just want to say that Newstead is often called the American Nobel because most of the writers who win this prize go on to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. She received a Fulbright U.S. Scholar Award to Kenya in 2019 and a research fellowship at the Institute of Advanced Studies in the Humanities at the University of Edinburgh. She's currently the editor of a short book series that I'm very excited to talk about. It's called Decolonize That, and Handbooks for the Revolutionary Overthrow of Embedded Colonial Ideas, which has been published by OR Books in New York, and the most recent book is Decolonize Drag. And I also recently finished reading Decolonize Multiculturalism, and they are basically like really fun books, but also scholarly, very, very rigorous. She's also an editor, a contributing editor at the Los Angeles Review of Books, titled, and it is columnist titled Defund and Abolish, which engages scholars, writers, and artists. And she has written for a numerous range of publications that I won't go to name because it'll take the whole time. I'm really excited again to welcome Bhakti. Please come here and deliver your talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This here, just to have time. Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming. I know it's so beautiful out, though Aruni tells me it's beautiful all the time here in Georgia, but I'm coming from the frigid East Coast. So I of course want to thank Aruni for setting this up, for allowing me to talk about a topic that I've been obsessed with for a very long time, have written about sporadically, though it's not been as much a part of sort of my academic writing or things like that. And, you know, publishing is what I'm talking about. And I've been attempting to chip away at various aspects of it through some academic research, but mainly through public engagement. And then, of course, through unofficial and possibly the most important sources, which is networks of gossips and rumors. Okay? That's how news about publishing travels, we all know. So I've also had some key vantage points when I talk about publishing. So first was the online magazine that I ran for 10 years called Warscapes, which, as Aruni said, transitioned into the Radical Books Collective. And it has sort of allowed me an insider view into many aspects of mainstream and independent publishing in North America, Europe, and the way it interacts with the global South. A second vantage point was offered by my day job as an academic, someone who worked for many, many, many years as an adjunct, because I was at the City University of New York system, so I was on the very low rung of things, and then got a tenure track job and got all the glitz and shine of tenure as well. So there's been many rungs of that. And I know that there's a sort of perception that academics publish very specialized research from somewhere high up in the ivory tower, and those that write in mainstream, public, accessible universe exist in a different realm. But the two worlds are actually quite connected, and they sort of bolster each other. A final vantage point is many years of being involved in various types of activism with regards to Palestine. As we know, they are suffering incredibly at the moment. And this is a place and people that are so deeply marginalized and censored that questions of publishing become very starkly illuminated, what publishing allows and doesn't allow. So, but before I do that, I want to set some parameters, of course, for the talk. For me, because my research has been focused a lot on the Cold War, I would say that the cultural Cold War, as it came to be called, is a sort of point of entry. And my focus is also primarily on the Anglophone world. English language publishing is, of course, very dominant and dominating. And so there's a lot we can ingest, even just with focusing on the Anglophone world. So by which I mean US, UK, all those post-colonial, previously colonized places in Africa, Asia, Middle East, Oceania. And then translation politics just generally is very fraught when it comes to publishing from other languages into English. That's where a lot of the politics kind of plays out. And then, of course, it is in English that we have many, many of these D words that I'm talking about. Diversity, decolonization, dismantling, decentering, divesting, deconstructing, dissecting, and so on. So the list is long. You can take what you want or can from it. So all of this tends to play out in the Anglophone sphere, which is on the one hand is indicative that this sort of churning means that there is a hunger for transformation, but it also expresses again a kind of planetary dominance. So how did I arrive at thinking and engaging with books and publishing, and what were the set of events that marked not just how I view publishing today, but which altered publishing itself, bringing us to what I'm sort of calling a crossroads or a moment of reckoning, which I think we are at. And I've realized that I need my glasses. Sorry, should have had them before. Okay, so in India, of course, like many people my generation, I came from a background where education meant everything. And, you know, in our home, that was like the end all and be all of your existence. So you were exempt from doing anything in the home during sort of exam season, where Indian kids learn by rote a million different things and then spit them out. I was also taken to a lot of libraries, showered with books and so on. So, of course, I've loved reading ever since I can remember, and I know many in this room will relate to that, and understand that reading can empower you and transform you and allow you to travel to many, many different destinations, literally whatever genre it might be. And so, you know, your brain and memory starts to lodge that information about those places. So this is a simple idea, but I think it becomes important later, because the hard work really lies in the unlearning of all that stuff that's been lodged. So when you arrive at a kind of point of epiphany, you may realize that you've been duped by the books you've been reading all your life. How do you unlearn? How do you undo? Okay. So I first came to the US to study at a very small artsy Bard college in upstate New York. I was super excited. I had left this sort of extremely draconian, exam-oriented system, and there was just a buffet of choices, an array of subjects I could mix and match, incredible amount of books available, not just in the libraries, but also tiny bookstores, medium-sized bookstores, and then the big Barnes & Noble type chains. It was just all absolutely eye-opening and amazing. But my love affair with this abundance and this illusion of free choice in the US came to an end in the aftermath of September 11th attack on the Twin Towers. Symbolically, I was walking to my first day of graduate school, and I turned around on Broadway and saw the second plane hit the tower. And it was also began soon after, within just a week or less, I soon became marked as public enemy number 1. It started with microaggressions, soon escalated into awful altercations with peers, professors, friends. I wasn't Arab, I wasn't Muslim, but that was my first experience of being absolutely racialized and cast as the other. And at that time, of course, there was a lot of interaction. We were not as online, but there used to be these listservs and these chat rooms at the time, and people would say crazy stuff, and everything had been just unleashed. So it was at that time, as a 20-something who had abstractly known about the role of books and media in manufacturing consent for wars, revising histories, and fabricating enemies out of thin air, it was a shock to my system to see it happen in actual real life. The American bookstores that I had fallen so much in love with were filled almost right away with shock value titles on terrorism and hawkish policy books justifying war. War is peace, war is the way to peace, violence as a way to be humanitarian, this kind of stuff. And the decimation of entire populations was being advocated pretty fiercely. It was a difficult time for me, for people who look like me. And I think what kept me going at the time, what kept me anchored, was being part of a very small community of people which started to gather together to discuss books, speak about difficult topics, organize a lot of poetry readings, to organize marches, sit-ins. And reading together, learning together allowed me to reroute these flows of information that I had, but the unlearning is what started then. And it gave me sort of tools and language to grasp what was going on. And I guess I realized then, and everyone had many different realizations at that time, but I realized then that there was a crisis around the type of knowledge that was being produced and who was getting to produce this knowledge. So it was a very resounding epiphany for me. When ideas are put on the page, they need to leave the room that they were born in and move into the world. Who has the power to move those ideas? Who decides? Who edits? Who publishes? Who promotes? And very importantly then, who reads? And for the first time, I started to sort of ask these questions. And as you can imagine, there was a pervasive sort of atmosphere of the war on terror and war in general, wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. All kinds of crazy things were going on. The Patriot Act had been signed in, and writings about war and violence came to occupy a lot about this, in this line of inquiry. So I came into the PhD program with a very different idea of what I wanted to do, and then everything got overtaken. I was mentored by poet and scholar Amiel Alcalay, who is who's of Bosnian origin, Bosnian Jewish origin, and he's also a translator, and he translated Bosnian poet Semezdin Mehmedinović's poems. And he has this great quote in one of the intros where he says, and I'm quoting him, "The creation of a receptive space for marginalized literatures or languages can occur through a variety of means. Unfortunately, in far too many instances, war and conflict become the primary means through which an unperturbed or disinterested audience connects to places far removed from the orbit of their ordinary aesthetic, formal, existential, or political concerns." And this is such an important observation, because this unperturbed or disinterested audience often tends to be a very powerful audience. And Amiel Alcalay was warning us that the cultural histories that are received are then often simplified ones, and these are often the ones that fall into the hands of those that shape votes, policies, attitudes. like wars that came before, the post 9/11 moment replicated, extended paradigm shifts that had occurred, and it might have ruptured a lot of naivety and sped up a lot of flows of information for many people. You know how people become experts overnight. That was happening then too. For me personally, everywhere I turned, I saw histories of war, violence, occupations. I had like a one-track vision, and that's all I saw. Palestine, Somalia, Algeria, Kashmir, Sudan, Rwanda, all the ex-Yugoslavian countries, Guatemala, El Salvador, the list just went on and on. Yet, the only books I ever saw were about the 2 world wars that were fought in Europe. And it seemed as if time itself had stopped there. And I don't think we've made particular progress on this issue, maybe a little bit. But, you know, why is it that we were we were inundated with stories from the 2 world wars. The 9/11 moment generated an opening for some trickling in, as Amyal had explained, but the question lingered, why had history stopped there? And even now the book market and film and TV market is heavily saturated actually with these accounts. Education is also such that in the US and Europe, many will know what happened during the 2 world wars, but they don't know what came before, colonialism, and almost absolutely no one will know what came after, decolonization movements and the Cold War, right? And it's a very odd trick of mind management, and one that I only started to understand when I started to dive into the cultural Cold War. So at that time, I also had my first brush with publishing, because my friend and I were learning a lot about the 1994 genocide of the Tutsis in Rwanda. And we found out that there was a group of writers who went and toured the place a few years later. The condition of that particular grant for them was that they produce work on Rwanda because it is the writer's obligation to archive, document, keep memory alive. So Senegalese writer Boris Babacar Diop was one of them and had written a novel in French called Murambi, the Book of Bones, about the events of the genocide through the eyes of a few different protagonists. My friend and I decided we must translate it. We were, you know, we had all this energy. We were in our early 20s. And we said, there's no fiction about Rwanda out there. By hook and crook, we got hold of the writer and had this amazing meeting in Harlem. And it turned out that an academic had secured a small grant to translate it, though she didn't have a publisher. So we're like, you know what? That's it. We're going to find the publisher. And we had also translated the first 50 pages. So we mobilized every New York City contact we had, because that was the advantage we had versus this other academic who turns out to be a super nice person, but she was our enemy at the time. So and we mobilized all these contacts, and the no's came in fast and furious. We kept following back because for us it was like, how can someone not be interested in this? And we were so naive, and we were told the same thing. We knew there was no such thing around, no fiction about Rwanda out there in English at the moment, and we were always told the same thing. Philip Gorovich, longtime staff writer of New Yorker and former Paris Review editor, had penned a harrowing reportage of the genocide in 1998. It was called "We Wish to Inform You That Tomorrow We Will Be Killed with Our Families." And while we were doing this, it was already 2003. So everything was stacked up against us. It was unviable because it was a translation. The style was not suitable for a certain type of creative sensibility. And again they kept saying Rwanda has been dealt with. And it thematically did not have the clear saviors and victims kind of arc as well. We said that, but listen, you know, Diop is black, he's African, this is the perspective you want to have, but nobody really, but it sort of all crashed and burned. And I understood that the space of publishing is very finite, and it gives very little room to non-white, non-Western stories. Sometimes you have one slot, maybe two. So scores of similar books on European world wars, but even one book was enough for Rwanda at the time. So I also started working part-time in publishing. I used to work 20 hours a week while I went to grad school for a literary scouting agency. I used to assist a person who read forthcoming books for film deals. And it was an absolute eye-opening experience. I went from learning how to critically read novels and do lit criticism, and at school, and then had to forego all of that and had to learn how to classify a book in commercial terms. Attention-grabbing comparisons had to be made. This story is Star Wars meets Jonathan Franzen's Corrections. These were the kind of, she would always be annoyed with me because I never had sensational enough comparisons. And I also learned that linear plots were favored. Literary experimentation was frowned upon. Depressing stories were frowned upon. Unless they were about self-empowerment, saviorism, uplifting journeys. Foreign and international stories set in non-Western places were seen as eligible. Characters from those foreign spaces in Western places were more favorable. So I soaked in all of this for years and years. So many of the questions formed during and after 9/11 were finally being answered. And the extraordinary important role of publishing in shaping hearts and minds was becoming more evident to me. Additionally, why was diversity, decolonization, multiculturalism such a moving goalpost in an industry that appeared liberal? They had a good faith desire to diversify, bring new stories. Everyone always cribbed, we want more diverse stories, we want new stories. Why were progressive and radical publishing futures not within our grasp? Like with decolonization and multiculturalism, these futures had been appropriated before they could come into view. And this is where I want to turn to my one of the chapters from my book, Cold War Assemblages. And the chapter is called The Cold War Paradigm, A Trajectory of Literary Canons. And my book explores the way in which covert actions and proxy wars funded and manipulated by the US and USSR destabilized decolonization movements in several regions, but they also simultaneously profoundly altered and subverted the realm of culture. And the post-colonial world we know today is materially and culturally profoundly shaped or unshaped and undone by this 45-year period of what was a very, very hot war. It wasn't cold at all. And the price of this very hot war was paid by previously colonized regions, and it was fought over black and brown bodies by two power-mad countries which were now fighting for imperial control. So in this chapter, I focus on the literary and publishing aspect of the Cold War by examining the interconnections of power, aesthetics, and narratives generated by a set of small magazines that were funded by the CIA through the front organization called the Congress for Cultural Freedom. Many things have been written about this now. And this is just one of my takes. So empire, however ubiquitous that term is, was the midwife that birthed a transnational network of contemporary literary culture, the one we have inherited today. European colonial authorities had already put institutions in place for these activities, and branches of the British Council and Alliance Française, for example, were commonplace in most metropolitan spaces in the colonized world. With the onset of the Cold War, the US and USSR took inspiration from these cultural missions that were the backbone for colonial civilizing agendas and created their own institution to further these existing imperatives. This phase came to be called the Cultural Cold War, and many projects were set up and sustained during the time. Some fell apart, but we have sort of inherited a way of thinking. So it's a very dynamic study for literary circuits and processes of canon formation as we know today. And my argument is that these interventions establish certain frameworks, trajectories, and networks that continue to influence the way literary publishing functions to this day, even with the coming of the internet. So CIA took books as an intervention very seriously, proven by the fact of a 673 report that they published sometime in the late 70s, where they said books are just really, really important. They can change somebody's mind within a second. And some of these books were directly published by the CIA, but majority went through cultural organizations that the agency funded and backed. The books that were written and published in collaboration with the CIA were openly anti-communist, tried to offer perspectives on the terrifying nature of life and government in the USSR. And the Congress for Cultural Freedom was much more sophisticated, and it did things in a much more complex and interesting and stylish ways. So it was founded in 1950, and then later when it was discovered that it was established and funded by the CIA, all of this was exposed. sometime in the late 60s, but a lot of these mechanisms had already been put into action. When the CCF was in action and fully up and working, it managed up to 30 small magazines over a course of 20 years. These small magazine interventions, along with the web of cultural propaganda that the CCF spun, were very influential with regards to how a certain American literary publishing culture was shaped during a very politicized and ideologically charged climate. So, manipulating culture and trying to use it as a soft form of coercion has been a tactic embedded within the civilizing logic of colonial policies. Andrew Rubin has an amazing book called Archives of Authority, Empire, Culture and the Cold War. And he writes about the British Council, for example, which was an extremely powerful association maintaining culture control over the cultural domain in its colonies by sending writers, books, recordings of authors' voices to represent British literature and culture. In 1957, it had 95 libraries in 57 countries with around 900,000 volumes and about 10,000 periodicals. I mean, the cultural presence was just extraordinary. So, when the United States came to occupy now this position, had the opportunity to occupy this position held by Britain and France in the years preceding the Second World War, it was the fight against communism that came to engage and control these strategies. But these efforts took place over almost 30 years and had many unplanned, potentially disconcerting resonances and sets of effects. They managed to transform the publishing industries in ways that had explicit and implicit connections to frameworks and paradigms put in place by the Cold War. The Congress for Cultural Freedom, the CCF, was run by CIA agent Michael Josselson at the beginning, and at its height it had offices in 35 countries, employed dozens of personnel, published around 30 magazines, held art exhibitions, owned a news and features service, organized high-profile international conferences, rewarded musicians and artists with prizes and public performances, and lots more. So it's interesting to study these magazines because they offer a broad view. You know, instead of us just studying maybe say one type of one book and what it contains, the magazines fostered a literary culture from editing, agents, conferences, events. You see all the different mechanisms of it. So the many years during which these interventions shaped the course of literary and academic culture culminated in the era of the Vietnam War, because all these protests broke out and yet another war. So yet another war shaping yet another paradigm. By this point, a certain kind of cultural apparatus has been put in place, and that included ways of marketing and promoting certain literature, strategies of book distribution, and the creation of literary taste through prizes, book clubs, modes of editing, and reviewing. So this is what these sets of apparatuses, if that's a word, this is what I call the Cold War paradigm. And there were many ways in which the CCF magazines controlled and manipulated culture, and there are 4 modes that I sort of identify that you will immediately recognize as how they function even today. So the most crude form, of course, we don't think it works that way anymore, but it just did last week. It's direct intervention. So this is when the CIA folk actually went and strong-armed mastheads. They replaced editors, they fired people. They would call this practice axing. And when they felt that the magazine was too pro-communist, overly political. There's a story of the CCF-funded magazine GU in Japan. They found them to be far too liberal in their critique of the US and the USSR. So it was almost like they were too both-sidist. So the entire masthead, they said, had to be replaced by our people. And some of this also happened in Beirut, in the Lebanese magazine Hiwar, where they kind of forced them to organize seminars on non-political literary themes. So these were some of the direct things. And by last week, I'm talking about the firing of the editor of Art Forum because of some of his views on the Middle East. Other approaches were more complex. So direct intervention was very crude. So the big one is the politics of visibility. What are the stories and narratives that become visible? So these magazines did not peddle crude anti-communist writing, but hoped to filter and delimit the discourses about the US rather than confront issues of cultural freedom overtly. As a result, knowledge about decolonizing spaces was carefully controlled. For example, Encounter magazine They published a translation and reprint of one of Albert Camus' essays in the inaugural issue called Wind at Jamila. And it was published in 1953, and it's a beautifully written essay that deftly straddles the genres of travel writing, memoir, philosophical rumination. Jamila is a town in Algeria without people, and it is an overwhelming, emotionally draining landscape of sun, wind, dust. In language riddled with Orientalist mystification and evocative colonial discovery, Algeria is simply rendered as a backdrop for abstract writing on existentialism, belying the reality, which is that it was an extraordinary violent nexus of Cold War politics at that time. So you can compare such an essay with the Fanon's bellicose writing on the Franco-Algerian War as it swept through every nook and cranny of the Algerian countryside. And it becomes evident how safe, idyllic, and digestible Camus' Algeria is. So Andrew Rubin has a great observation about which authors were chosen and which authors were not, and I can just put these out there. Some might resonate. On the whole, the magazines published by the CCF, and I quote from him, ensured that only certain writers who were socially certified to comment on political affairs were published. It rarely censored its writers because for the most part it did not need to do so. Their positions had been chosen in advance. It could publish Albert Camus, nor Jean-Paul Sartre, Richard Wright, but not Frantz Fanon or C.L.R. James, Wole Soyinka, but not Derek Walcott, Edith Sitwell, but not Doris Lessing, Isaiah Berlin, but not John Berger, and so on. So Rubin's strategic classification of who was in and who was out reveals the disturbing ways in which entire bodies of writing were excluded from what eventually constituted what was read and disseminated within the cultural Anglosphere. The CCF also solidified strategies of cross-posting, cross-promotion, award hype around a certain work so that it became commonly accepted that this was important, this work was important. They ensured that circulation was expressly within the CIA CCF funded magazines through very particular travel grants, funding certain conferences, literary events, paying for the travel of certain writers and so on. So they created this echo chamber around particular works, authors, and the repetition of that, the constant repetition was very key here, and we think this is something that was invented by social media. This stuff was happening, and it was happening through letters and happening through various events already. Discrediting writers was a big strategy too. Smear campaigns against John Berger and Pablo Neruda are proof of this. This is all well documented. Letters going back and forth between influential people trying to stop the publication of John Berger's book and ensuring that Pablo Neruda did not win the Nobel. The third strategy is the politics of the apolitical. Here everybody knows the story of CIA attempting to fund the work of Jackson Pollock because the work was so fancy and so abstract that it could not mean it meant that it was hard to squeeze any politics out of it and allowed the Americans to compete on a sort of avant-garde European sphere. So in the politics of the apolitical, when it came to literature, literary style was a huge part of this. Values such as detachment, abstractness, aesthetic experimentation were privileged over vociferous, openly critical, politically radical works, illustrating that a diluted type of modernism had been co-opted by the CCF as a style that they thought was bereft of politics. So the long essay which we encountered to date, even in venues such as Paris Review or New York or Harper's, is an offshoot of something that was perfected at that time. It was a very particular style. The last one, which is always boggles my mind, was to do with the politics of dissidence. So this is a particular type of intervention that applied heavily to foreign literature, which interests me, of course. So we always make fun of the US for its over-the-top kind of use of the term freedom, brand freedom. But the truth is that brand freedom was really hard won during the Cold War. And the CCF actually played a large role in cultivating writing that was anti-communist but not crudely so, dissident but not activist, liberal but not leftist, stylistically pleasing but not jarringly experimental. So the balance was very intense. So dissidence and dissident writing was very important because it represented the fight against everything going on behind the Iron Curtain, which was associated with totalitarianism, censorship, lack of freedom. So foreign writing in a way came to be seen through this lens as writers we need to rescue. And they came about a fetish for like the Third World or the East European writer as a dissident writer, as an exiled writer. And this continues even to this day. I have a very funny example about Chimamanda Adichie from 2015. So PEN America, as you know, long-standing organization invested in protecting the freedom of expression and human rights of writers worldwide. So it has an annual literary festival called the PEN World Voices Festival, which invites non-Western writers to participate, especially those who have experienced censorship, imprisonment, torture, exile for their political views. And the figure of the dissident is honored, and the themes of the festival's panel tend to explore these issues: political literature, freedom of expression, dissent, and so on. In 2015, the festival decided to focus on Africa and African writers. And participants included prolific figures: Ngugi wa Thiong'o, formerly imprisoned Kenyan writer; Boris Diop, courageous critic of France's role in Rwanda's genocide; Mona El-Hatawi, audacious Egyptian feminist; Zanele Muholi, queer visual activist, and many, many important, incredible figures were present. And the festival usually ends with a very high-profile keynote with a person who has had some experience with censorship or rights infringement. So past keynotes have been delivered by Orhan Pamuk, Nawal El-Saadawi, Salman Rushdie, Sonia Sotomayor, and so on. So in 2015, even with all these dissident writers present, the festival chose Nigerian writer Chimamanda Adichie to deliver the keynote. It was a very odd choice, since Adichie's trajectory did not have a lot in common with censored, exiled, or dissident writers. And no one was more sensitive to this than Adichie herself. In her usual entertaining and anecdotal way, she confessed that agreeing to deliver this lecture made her nervous. Adichie said she wished she had, and I quote, a dramatic story of being hauled off to prison by Nigerian soldiers because of something I had written. In this honest and self-reflective opening to her keynote, she said, and I quote, "But since I do not have such a story, I do not have such a story, sadly." And she continued, "An American journalist once asked me what it was like to be in exile. I kept telling her I was not in exile, and she kept asking about exile. And then when I managed to finally convince her I was not in exile, she said, okay, would I then talk about other African writers who were in exile? I got the disturbing sense that the journalist wanted me to be in exile. There's something almost titillating about the writer from a foreign and preferably developing country who's in exile." And she started her keynote by saying that, which is sort of provocative and intense. So her very distraught and shocking admission spoke volumes about the way in which the exiled dissident is perceived in the United States. It showed the extent to which this figure of the dissident has come to be synonymous with writers from Africa, Middle East, Latin America, Asia, and so on. And secondly, her anecdote about the American journalist, evidence of the allure that the figure holds for our literary culture. Though the story of Adichie and PEN may express what I'm trying to say in very crude terms, it seems that, you know, it does show us that there is an attraction to the dissident and the attraction to saving that particular dissident writer. And it's always projected onto the non-Western other. And I would say that this is located and situated within those very cultural interventions taking place during the Cold War. So these were my four things: direct intervention, politics of visibility, the politics of dissident, and the politics of the apolitical. And so then I want to tie in the ways that these interventions in publishing impact us today. And I think the first set of effects of these almost 30 years of doing publishing was felt in the aftermath of the Vietnam War. There's a brilliant book by Jim Nielsen called Warring Fictions, American Literary Culture in the Vietnam War Narrative. And it's about academic and literary publishing culture in the US. And Nielsen uses the critical reception of Vietnam War novels within the US as a point of entry and as a site for investigating not merely the vicissitudes of literary taste, but the ideology of literary culture. Through an apolitical aesthetics, modest critiques of the war, and the production and reproduction of some circumcised views, literary culture culture managed to help revise the war in accord with the needs of capital, Nielsen says. He says, how can a nation that had a massive anti-war movement, had once expressed outrage over US atrocities, suddenly become oblivious to these histories and their representations? Why, he demands, is it so difficult to find the violence of these proxy wars and civil wars, represented in literary and cultural spheres. This manicured cultural space succeeded in covering up American realities overseas, and cultural interventions played a deliberate and strategic role in creating a dichotomy between political realities and their representations within the space of culture. So Nielsen's study evaluates the critical response of these Vietnam War novels and offers a kind of longue durée of understanding. So he outlines the book's journey. How is the book chosen in the first place? Nielsen's statistics reflect the particular moment after the Vietnam War, but I think it's still quite similar. So he shows that only 1 out of 30,000 unsolicited book submissions was likely to be published, since it was not chosen by an agent or editor. Criteria for rejection will include things as the book is too depressing, too difficult, too foreign. This explains to a large degree, and this, I heard all this stuff straight up when I worked in publishing. And this is why this is why we think of Tim O'Brien's Things They Carried as a grand work of Vietnam War. We think of Michael Hare's Dispatches as a grand work of the Vietnam War. And these both have a kind of vague politics, And Dispatches, for example, is hallucinatory, fragmented, modernist, and so on. If we teach Vietnamese literature to just a class of American students, no one will be able to name a Vietnamese writer. I'm certain of it, and I'm not talking about contemporary ones, but ones writing about the Vietnam War at that time. So to recap, almost done here, the 2 decades of the psychological warfare and soft power interventions put in place by the CIA and other security agencies through the infiltration of media, publishing, academia play a significant defining role in sustaining the Cold War paradigm in the 90s and well into the 21st century. And this paradigm can be defined as a manufactured consensus, that one that starts to function as an obvious logic about what constitutes good, sometimes great literature. And it's a framework that tends to privilege a particular American narrative that pushes international translated works to the margins. And this happens without censorship, but through the sort of 4 interventions I spoke of. These strategies mobilize a network of people that may include agents, reviewers, funders, prize committee members, academics, and so on, to confer merit and value upon a certain book and a certain writer. And what started out as the CIA trying out various approaches to making certain politics visible or invisible has now become a tried and tested practice in publishing. One of the Cold War interventions that bothers me deeply is that it generated the idea that political literature is not tasteful literature, it's not good literature, that it's propaganda. And I think the grand success of the cultural Cold War is that it took 30 years of propaganda to really deeply embed the idea that propaganda is a really bad word. And so openly political literature is not good literature, and this schism between literature and politics is something we encounter again and again and again, and more unconsciously than we even tend to see. So today, the typical journey of a published work of literature starts with the author finding an agent, who then finds an editor, who then puts a marketing dynamic in place, which then leads to reviewers. The title, synopsis, blurbs that editors and agents co-generate also end up with reviewers. The reviewers will use them and then work through a basic interpretation of the book and generate a place for it within strategic categories: crime, African American, international, women, etc. And then the reviews also have to be published in very specific periodicals for a book to move in a particular way. Many publish and then republish reviews of the same authors, or disproportionately publish reviews from particular publishing houses. So it's a very it's a bit of a cesspool. In the US, it is rare to see reviewers and publishers leave the comfort zone of having the editors and agents determine whether the book is valid or not, whether it's deserving of merit, potentially important. So, and reviewing books, that don't seem aligned with national geopolitical interests is not a common practice either. So, I'm going to end by saying that we do live in an unprecedented time for publishing, with everyone reading more than ever, whether it's physical books or phones or computers. There's no crisis of publishing. If anything, publishing is thriving at some level. It's just how you look at it. There's ebooks and audiobooks, and there's so much online content. It has invigorated the world of reading, writing, editing, publishing. But the big commercial publishing will take revolutionary concepts sometimes and turn them into commodities to be sold to everyone. So marketing has gotten easier. And our reading habits have also been taken over by smartphones and the internet. We read on screens, we read headlines, quotations, memes, we ditch long reads, we do 3-minute quick reads, we pile up the PDFs and the ebooks, but we may not open them, So there's a kind of lack of depth. There's a lot of availability of material, but the engagement with it has kind of diluted, and there's a sort of lack of depth. And so reading then has kind of has stopped being it's coming in the way of movement and community building, or devising systematic push towards uprooting traditional frameworks of knowledge. So in publishing and in education, books have become so curated and compartmentalized that they don't allow different streams of knowledge to overlap and intersect. So radical ideas like anti-racism, decolonization, diversity, feminism are all co-opted and repackaged into mainstream spaces. And this is something that at the Radical Books Collective we do try to combat. We try to mix fiction with non-fiction, with political manifesto, and you'll see that it's very hard to find a mixed grouping. People who read lefties will say, no, I'm not going to read fiction, that's silly, and then the fiction people will not read non-fiction, and the compartmentalization and the self-censorship is very intense in this case. So the idea, of course, is that we are new and very tiny, but trying to politicize reading and book culture. And many publishing exposés and scandals in recent years have also shown that corporatization and profit imperatives are squashing independent presses, and gatekeeping practices remain rampant, and the problem of diversity keeps on looming. It just doesn't go away. And the last few centuries of European colonialism have eroded these structures of knowledge, and we are not engaging with that. Through these violent interventions in publishing and education, we have inherited those structures that continue to impact language, translation, publishing infrastructure, costs, distribution, reviews, and access to books. And we desperately need a kind of a deeper and a longer historical view to imagine radical publishing futures. So I'll stop there.